You won't believe what happened when the HOA bulldozed my cousin's home for their new project, unaware that he's a U.S. Army general. Keep watching to see how one man's fight for justice turned into a battle that shocked an entire community. Before we dive in, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you more incredible stories like this one. The morning had started like any other. Daniel Carter, a highly decorated U.S. Army general, had just returned from a year-long deployment and was finally back at his suburban home in Oak Ridge Estates. After months of grueling work in foreign lands, Daniel was looking forward to spending some much-needed time with his family, catching up with old friends, and reconnecting with the community he'd grown up in. As he sipped his coffee and glanced through a few emails, his phone rang, and the voice on the other end of the line caught him off guard. It was Mrs. Jenkins, his elderly neighbor, and she sounded completely distressed. Through her panicked breathing, she managed to tell Daniel that a bulldozer was currently tearing down his house. Her voice trembled, almost frantic with disbelief, and the gravity of the situation started to sink in. At first, Daniel thought it had to be some kind of mistake, maybe a mix-up with another property or some sort of construction accident. But as Mrs. Jenkins continued to speak, it became evident that this was no mistake. His home was truly being destroyed. Without a moment's hesitation, Daniel bolted out of his chair, grabbing his keys and rushing out the door. The drive back to his house was a blur, but the closer he got to his neighborhood, the more his heart began to race. He couldn't wrap his head around the idea of his house being reduced to rubble. Oak Ridge Estates wasn't some rundown neighborhood. It was a quiet, established suburban community with well-kept homes, tree-lined streets, and families who had lived there for decades. The thought of his family's home being demolished felt like a nightmare. As he rounded the corner to his street, Daniel's stomach turned. His house, the home he'd spent years building into the perfect sanctuary after his military deployments, was being obliterated. The bulldozers, massive and unmoving, were clawing into the structure of his house, tearing down walls and roofs as dust and debris billowed into the air. The sound of crashing walls and splintering wood echoed through the street, and all Daniel could do was watch as the home he cherished was slowly dismantled before his eyes. His heart ached as he scanned the scene. The shattered windows, the broken furniture now buried under a pile of rubble, his father's military memorabilia lost to the wreckage. His entire life, in essence, was being reduced to nothing. The photos on the walls, his medals, the things that meant the most to him were now buried under tons of debris. As Daniel stood frozen, trying to process what was happening, he saw a group of workers milling about. Some were directing the bulldozer operators. Others were hastily tossing personal belongings aside as if they were mere trash. But there, standing with an air of smug authority, was Linda Mathers, the HOA president. She was overseeing the destruction with an almost gleeful expression, completely unfazed by the wreckage. The sight of her standing there, so calm and indifferent, fueled a growing rage inside Daniel. He could barely contain himself as he marched toward her, his military training kicking in. His voice boomed as he demanded an explanation. He didn't just want answers. He wanted justice for the destruction of his property, for the loss of his family's home. Linda barely seemed to register the intensity in his voice. She looked at him with an air of condescension and responded with a cold, dismissive tone. She told him that the HOA had voted to seize several properties in the neighborhood to make way for a new modernized clubhouse. His house, along with a few others, had been chosen for demolition to accommodate the new development. She spoke with authority, as though Daniel were just another absentee homeowner whose house wasn't important enough to matter. The casual manner in which she delivered this news made Daniel's blood boil. This wasn't just any house. It was his family's legacy, a home that had been passed down for generations. It wasn't some insignificant property to be tossed aside for the sake of a clubhouse. But the biggest shock came when Daniel questioned her about why he hadn't been notified about this project. Linda simply shrugged and said the HOA had sent out notices to all property owners, but because Daniel had been away on deployment, it was his responsibility to have kept up with the HOA's communications. She barely seemed to care that he hadn't received anything due to his absence. In fact, She seemed more annoyed that he was even questioning the HOA's decision. She mentioned that the HOA had the legal right to make these decisions, and if Daniel had any objections, he could take it up with their legal team. Linda didn't even try to hide her indifference. She was convinced that Daniel, like other absent homeowners, was an inconvenience to be dealt with. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Daniel, however, wasn't just some absentee homeowner who would roll over and accept this injustice. He wasn't just a regular guy. He was a U.S. Army general with decades of experience leading troops, strategizing on battlefields, and navigating complex situations. He knew how to fight, and he wasn't about to let this fight slip away. The thought of losing his home without a fight was unfathomable. This wasn't just a piece of property to him. It was his legacy, his family's history, and it represented everything he had worked for in his life. The more Linda dismissed him, the more determined Daniel became. Little did she know, she had just picked a fight with a force far more powerful than she could imagine. This would not end with a few bulldozers and some broken concrete. It was about to escalate, and the HOA would soon regret underestimating who they were dealing with. In the days following the destruction of his home, Daniel found himself in an unfamiliar position, powerless. As a seasoned U.S. Army general, he was no stranger to adversity, but the emotional weight of this fight felt different. His house, his history, was gone, and the legal battle ahead promised to be a long and brutal one. The HOA, led by Linda Mathers, had dismissed him out of hand, believing him to be just another absentee homeowner with no real voice in the community. But Daniel wasn't about to let this stand. His military background made him a master of tactics, of patience, and of executing plans with precision. He understood that this wouldn't be a battle won in the heat of the moment. It would require careful strategy, allies, and the ability to turn the tide in his favor. The first step was to assess his options. Daniel knew he had to act quickly, but he also understood that confronting the HOA head-on would be a mistake if not done properly. He began by gathering information. Daniel hired a local attorney, a man named Robert Shaw, who had experience dealing with property disputes and HOA legal matters. Robert, a middle-aged man with a sharp mind and a calm demeanor, immediately saw the weight of the case. He knew the HOA had overstepped their bounds, but getting them to admit it would be another matter. The first few meetings with Robert were tense. Daniel pored over maps, agreements, and old property records. He didn't just want to fight for his property back. He wanted to expose the HOA's corruption. Through his research, they discovered something crucial. The HOA's plans for the modernized clubhouse were tied to a series of shady deals and secretive board meetings that were never properly disclosed to the residents. Many of the homeowners hadn't even been aware of the scope of the project, and Daniel was now certain that this wasn't just about a revitalization plan. There was more at play here: money, influence, and greed. Meanwhile, Linda Mathers continued to stand by her decision, underestimating Daniel at every turn. She had no idea of the storm brewing in the background. What she thought was a simple case of bureaucracy and paperwork was about to erupt into a full-scale legal battle, and Daniel had no intention of backing down. As the days passed, Daniel reached out to other homeowners who had been affected by the demolition. Many of them had heard the whispers, but none had dared to challenge the HOA's authority. As he spoke with them, they started to open up. Some of them were former military veterans like Daniel. Others were longtime residents who had lived in Oak Ridge estates for decades. They all shared the same sentiment, an overwhelming sense of betrayal. They'd all been ignored, their voices silenced by the HOA's push for a new development. They were fed up, and soon, Daniel had gathered a small but formidable coalition of homeowners who were ready to take on the HOA. Together, they started to plan their counterattack. Daniel knew he couldn't win this battle alone. He started attending HOA meetings, observing the power dynamics at play. Linda Mathers, as expected, was smug and condescending, acting as though her position was unassailable. But Daniel had seen this kind of arrogance before in his military career, and he knew how to handle it. He didn't confront her directly yet. He bided his time, using the meetings to gather allies and information. Every meeting, Daniel spoke with a calm, measured tone. He made sure to ask tough questions and highlight the inconsistencies in the HOA's plans. Little by little, he began to sow seeds of doubt in the other homeowners' minds. The more they learned, the angrier they became. What Daniel didn't know yet was that his presence in these meetings was beginning to rattle the HOA's leadership. Linda Mathers had underestimated him as a simple, angry homeowner. But Daniel's intellect, his calm and measured approach, were starting to chip away at the HOA's authority. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting, Daniel was approached by a quiet man named Frank Adler, a former Army medic who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 30 years. Frank had been one of the homeowners who had been directly impacted by the demolition and was fed up with the HOA's actions. He told Daniel he had been doing some research of his own and had uncovered a paper trail that could potentially expose the HOA's illegal maneuvers. It turned out that the HOA's contracts with construction companies were laced with suspicious clauses, and several of the board members had financial stakes in the companies that were overseeing the development. Daniel now knew this battle was about more than just his home. It was about the entire neighborhood, about ensuring that Linda Mathers and her board couldn't continue to exploit their position for personal gain. As the days went by, Daniel's resolve only grew stronger. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that the HOA's plans weren't just about revitalization. They were about a lucrative real estate scheme that had been built on deception. But the deeper he dug, the more dangerous things became. Linda Mathers wasn't going to let him, or anyone, undermine her plans without a fight. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not just determine Daniel's future, but the future of everyone in Oak Ridge Estates. Daniel was no longer just fighting for his house. He was fighting to protect the community, to expose corruption, and to bring accountability to a system that had long been unchecked. The momentum had shifted. Daniel Carter had gone from being an enraged homeowner to the leader of a small army of residents who were ready to take on the corrupt HOA. As weeks passed, the legal team and the coalition of homeowners he had rallied around him began to gather more and more evidence. Every meeting with the HOA became a chess match. Daniel, playing the long game, slowly and methodically began to dismantle Linda Mathers' position. She, on the other hand, had grown increasingly defensive, unaware that Daniel's strategic planning was beginning to pay off. The HOA board thought they had in the bag. Their arrogance blinded them to the power of Daniel's coalition. Linda continued to make dismissive remarks, thinking she could easily crush anyone who dared oppose her. But Daniel was playing his cards carefully, making sure that every move he made counted, and every word spoken planted seeds of doubt. Daniel's lawyer, Robert Shaw, had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, combing through public records, building a case, and securing testimonies from residents. Together, they discovered a gold mine. One of the contractors working on the project had been involved in a series of fraudulent schemes tied to the HOA's development plans. The contractor had bribed key board members, including Linda Mathers, to secure the demolition contracts under the table, cutting deals that were illegal and grossly underhanded. They found the financial trails that tied Linda and other board members to these illicit dealings, and the weight of the evidence was enough to send shockwaves through the neighborhood. The board had been laundering money through overpriced contracts and had been planning to flip the neighborhood for a huge profit. But Daniel wasn't interested in just getting back at Linda. He was determined to bring her and the other corrupt HOA members to justice. The tipping point came when Daniel's coalition, emboldened by the growing evidence, organized a public town hall meeting. They invited all of Oak Ridge Estates to come forward, share their experiences, and speak out against the HOA. The room was packed with frustrated homeowners, parents, military veterans, and longtime residents who had all been blindsided by the HOA's actions. Daniel stood in front of the crowd, calm but resolute, knowing that the moment had come. He outlined the corruption within the HOA, pointing to the illegal financial dealings, the destruction of homes, and the secretive plans that had been hidden from the very people who lived in the neighborhood. He presented the documents, the testimonies, and the hard evidence that showed how Linda Mathers had betrayed the trust of the entire community for personal gain. For the first time, the residents saw what was really at stake. They weren't just fighting to save a few homes. They were fighting for the integrity of their entire neighborhood. Linda Mathers, who had been sitting at the front of the room, her arms crossed in defiance, began to shift uncomfortably. Her smug expression had started to crack as she realized that the walls were closing in around her. As Daniel methodically laid out the case against her, he could see her growing frustration. She attempted to interrupt him, but Daniel's steady voice and calm demeanor cut through her protests. The people in the room had finally woken up. They had seen the truth for the first time, and they were angry, furious that they had been deceived for so long. It was clear that Linda's grip on power was slipping fast. With the evidence now in the public domain, the situation took a dramatic turn. Daniel and Robert Shaw filed a formal lawsuit against the HOA, seeking not only to restore the homes that had been destroyed, but also to hold the board accountable for their illegal actions. It didn't take long for the news of the lawsuit to spread throughout the community, and soon, local media outlets began to pick up the story. The press coverage put even more pressure on the HOA, who now had no choice but to face the public backlash. Linda Mathers tried to deflect, claiming that she had done everything within her legal rights. But the overwhelming weight of the evidence and public outcry made it impossible for her to maintain her position. In the weeks that followed, the HOA was forced to conduct an internal investigation, and as more details emerged, it became clear that the board had been involved in a massive scheme to profit from the development of the neighborhood. Linda was removed from her position, and the other board members were either forced to resign or were brought under investigation for their involvement in the scandal. As part of the settlement, Daniel and the other affected homeowners received compensation for the destruction of their properties, and the HOA was legally mandated to halt the construction of the new clubhouse and reverse all the damage done to the community. For Daniel, the victory wasn't just in winning the case. It was in the message it sent to the entire neighborhood. He had fought for what was right, not just for himself, but for everyone in Oak Ridge Estates. His determination to expose the corruption of the HOA had inspired others to stand up for their rights, and the neighborhood had been forever changed. Daniel's name became synonymous with justice and resilience, and his victory was a beacon for those who had felt powerless in the face of authority. The war had been long and exhausting, but in the end, Daniel had come out victorious, not because of his rank or his background, but because of his unshakable belief in what was right. As Daniel stood in front of his rebuilt home, looking over the familiar landscape of Oak Ridge Estates, he knew that he had done more than just reclaim a house. He had restored the integrity of a community, protected his family's legacy, and sent a message to anyone who thought they could trample on the rights of others. Linda Mathers and her cronies had learned the hard way. No matter how much power they could never underestimate the strength of one determined individual who was willing to fight for what was right.